Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. My guest today is an HR consultant at Face to Face HR in Harrow near London. She helps businesses navigate people challenges with practical, no-nonsense advice that works in the real world. Today, we're going to be talking about what's working in HR and what working in HR looks like in 2026, how the role has changed in recent years, and then the generational trends that she's noticing in the workplace. So, lots to talk about, and we were just chatting before we went on air that we realised that Farzana is the very first HR professional I've had on my podcast, so very excited that she's here. So, Farzana Parkar, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alastair. Thanks so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this. And of course, a real pleasure. I'm really happy to be the first HR person to be doing this. So as Alastair introduced me, I am a HR consultant. I work with businesses of all shapes and sizes, helping them navigate the often tricky world of people management and employment law. I've been in HR for about, 15 years now. And honestly, the landscape looks very different from when I started. But one thing that's never changed is that at the heart of every workplace challenge, there's always a people story. And more often than not, those stories come down to how well people understand each other.
That's something that I'd love to get into in terms of what's changed, what remains the same, the elements that we would recognise and maybe those that we don't. If you don't mind, I'd like to step back first before we get into the world of HR, because I always love the fact that we are framed by our generation, our thinking, and we're framed by the way we were brought up, the environment in which we were brought up. So tell us a little bit about you, whether you feel that you are typical of your generation, whether you, and how that has framed you in the work that you now do. So yeah, tell us a bit about your upbringing.
So I feel that generational differences in the workplace aren't just an interesting conversation. They're something I see kind of playing out in businesses every single week. And when it goes wrong, it can be really costly, both in terms of people's well-being and the bottom line. From my perspective, I feel in terms of, I call myself a Xennial, so a mixture between a Generation X and a millennial. So I kind of feel I have the sandwich between the baby boomers and the millennials, even though I appreciate the Gen Zs are really coming out in force at the moment. So I identify with both generations, if that makes sense. So I've always
completely, yeah.
It's
not a strict cut-off point. You know, you're not a millennial, or there's an ebb and flow of all of that. And being an ex-Xennial, you're quite right. You are caught in that sort of position where the majority of the workplace right now, the biggest representation of any generation is millennial right now, because some Gen Xers have already left the workplace or they're on the way to leaving the workplace. And of course, all Gen Z aren't there yet, the youngest still being 15. So actually, as a millennial, you are representing a cohort, if you like, who are probably the highest represented in the workplace.
Yeah, 100%. So, I've, for the first time, I'm also noticing, Alastair, is that workplaces can have 4 or even 5 generations working together side by side, each with different values, communication styles and expectations. Younger employees, for example, the Gen Zs want purpose, flexibility and frequent feedback, and they don't respond well to rigid top-down management, which is what I've kind of been exposed to when I left university. That's how it pretty much was. And then older generations often bring loyalty, resilience and institutional knowledge, but can feel overlooked and sidelined sometimes because of the newer skills that the Gen Zs are bringing into the workforce. Even millennials, I would say, to a certain degree, as you say, because they're representing a majority of the workforce. But I find that conflict often arises not from personality clashes, but from generational assumptions. So, for example, attitudes to office presence, response times, or what respect looks like. So, which I found was interesting. But businesses that do understand like generational differences are better at retaining talent and reducing conflict, I found. So they have a true harmonious kind of process, institution in place.
Yeah, I think that's the evidence is absolutely there to support that. And you talked there a little bit about when you first left university and came into the workplace. Tell me about that. What was it like, when you joined the workplace? First of all, what did you train as? What was your first job? And what was that like coming into the workplace then?
So it's not a typical route into HR. It's a bit of a squiggly career, if you like. I actually did a degree in media production and technology. So I had this idea of becoming a writer, a journalist, and I thought, okay, right, I'm going to become a journalist, and then the writing career will come afterwards. So that's essentially what I studied at university, and I then worked at a couple of magazines. When I left university, it didn't take very long for me to actually find my first job. Not compared to the graduates who are coming out of university now, it is quite difficult. But I would say it took me about 9 to 10 months. So I was temping with a very well-known recruitment agency all around London, and I was just doing reception jobs, which was great because it gave me exposure to lots of different organizations, how they ran things and what the people were like. And then it wasn't until I got my first permanent job that I was kind of almost thrust into like a proper, work environment, meeting the types of different people. But one thing, when I was, as I entered the workforce, I did work in an agency, and I met this guy, and I think I must have been having a little bit of a kind of rant. I think probably because I didn't understand, what is all this work like, and why is this person behaving this way? And he said to me, Farzana, one thing you'll need to learn when you leave university is you need to play the game. And I'm like, what do you mean play the game? But as I actually entered as I started working in the different organizations, I totally got it, because that's essentially what it is. And, and I'm wondering if that's perhaps another reason why the generational differences have evolved to a certain degree, because some people, especially again going back to the Gen Z, not to pick on them, but they don't want to play the game. They want the organizations to take them as they are. They don't want to do the schmoozing. So when I was younger, it was very typical for it would be a certain hierarchy, how directors would behave and how you were expected to behave and give that type of respect and authority. But Gen Zs are not interested in that. So, that's what I find quite fascinating.
So when you're in your role right now as in HR, and you've highlighted something there, which is a big difference between the generations. So on one hand, you're having to explain to employers and HR people, with the organizations that you're working with, to explain how this generation are, the fact that they think differently. Again, I use the phrase all the time, we're framed by our generation, not defined by it. So I don't want to stereotype, but there are definite patterns which exist amongst their generation. So on one hand, you're having to train employers to understand the differences of the people who are coming in. Are you also helping Gen Zs to understand that there is still a bit of a game when you come to employment? Or is that a bit of a lost cause because you feel actually that doesn't resonate with them at all?
To a certain degree, I think it's important that they understand organizations' rules and procedures, essentially processes. I'm always a big advocate for all organizations, whether it's small or large, to have a really robust induction process. And it applies to all generations. At this point, it's someone who's new joining the company. They need to understand what the company is, what their kind of rules and regulations are, if you like, and how they like to do things. Impress upon the culture. Culture is a big thing, which I find is also something it's really, culture is very important to all companies essentially, but I find the difference in culture is also led by how many what type of generation they typically have, the number. So I would say that, while to a certain degree they are like, take me as I am, they at the same time, there's no harm in businesses ensuring that the induction for the new person is very, very thorough, so they understand exactly what's expected of them. Because that's the other thing as well, the generations, you need to be very explicit. I find that when I entered the workforce, there was a lot of subtext, a lot of things that you had to assume things. But the newer generations is like, well, no, explain to me very clearly what you're asking me to do, so then I can make sure I do it, which again, I find quite interesting.
Yeah, and it's challenging. If you were brought up in a certain way, you're used to certain methodologies, then all of a sudden you're having to learn different ways because the newer cohorts think differently. Obviously that takes some getting used to. And I've always advocated how important it is, that onboarding process. And in fact, I've had a couple of guests on this podcast who've talked about their experiences firsthand as Gen Zs going into organizations where that onboarding is not as strong as it maybe should be. One of the things that I hear a lot, and I'd be interested to see whether you're experiencing the same, is, you talked about transparency. We hear the word authenticity a lot. And that we know that Gen Z, again, as a pattern, that's what they're looking for. But there seems to be a disconnect sometimes between the recruitment process and then the onboarding process, so that when a Gen Z, or anybody for that matter, is recruited into the company, what they discover when they get there is sometimes a little bit different. Is that something that you find in your work?
Absolutely. Alice, it's quite interesting you bring that up. It happens more often than you think. And generally, I find that the reason for that is because when businesses need to recruit, and it's a role that perhaps that's been they've recruited for quite very recently, someone's leaving them, so they present this idea of what their company is. And then they generally kind of give the brief to a recruitment agency or whoever, or even the recruiter presents this opportunity as, oh, this company is amazing, this is what they do, this is how we help. The reality is when they join, they don't see that at all. And that is really dangerous. I feel like it's really important that a leadership team walks the talk. So if you are saying, again, going back to what I was talking about culture, if you are going to, have this ideal of what your business should be or how they should behave, and you want your employees to reflect that, then essentially the leadership team have to emulate it right from the outset. One of the things I've learned in my career, and it's and I'm going to mention my almost like my unofficial mentor. When I went into HR, the chief HR officer, she taught me so much. I learned so much from her. She came in and transformed the organization, and the way she changed the culture was just like amazing to see. But one of the things I learned from her was that the HR's role is to support the leadership team to embed the culture into the company, not lead. Leading of the culture should always come from the leadership team or the senior management team. They're the ones who should be singing from the same hymn sheet and presenting the company as is, because that is what people will see, irrespective of what their generation is. That is what people will see.
Yeah, and how often do we hear, and I find it in my work, and I know other people, where you're brought in by the senior management team and they say, make our staff do this, make our staff do that, when actually leadership starts from the top. And I know people who will refuse to work with an organization if they don't get that 100% buy-in from the senior management team, that actually they're on board with it and they will support everything that you're doing to the point that they will then continue it once you've left. Because otherwise it actually becomes rather pointless you trying to change anything. As you've quite rightly said, culture starts from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And a classic example of that is a very well-known, I'm not sure if I can name the brand here, but a very well-known challenger kind of beer company that kind of launched with a bang and recently went bust. And they were a prime example of how this is how they presented themselves. Everyone thought, oh, wow, this is a really hip brand, or whatever the latest Gen Z word is for cool. And everyone wants to buy that. Oh, it must be so cool working there. But in reality, it was completely different. And it doesn't surprise me at all that they went bust.
And isn't it interesting today in the world of Glassdoor and social media and all of those other platforms where the word will get out really, really quickly, that actually that reputational management that a company has to retain its staff is huge. They've got a huge job to do there, haven't they?
Massively, absolutely. It's Glassdoor. I wouldn't be surprised if organizations are on Trustpilot. I mean, at the moment, Trustpilot seems to be kind of like getting out there. But yes, Glassdoor, Indeed as well. Indeed, there's a lot of feedback left about Indeed, and then a lot of other social media or other places that people really haunt or really research is LinkedIn. How big how strong are the company on LinkedIn and what do they put on there? I mean, I'll give you an example, Alastair, is Monzo. Monzo is Monzo Bank. Their social media team are on point, to the point that you can tell that a lot of people, that when they have fun, they have a lot of fun in their social media. But when I see their posts, you can tell that that's exactly how it is working there. There's, I wouldn't, you can tell that the culture there is really fun and really enjoyable to work at.
And it is all about culture, which makes it also very, very difficult for organizations if the culture isn't quite right. So you can understand why so many people are doing a lot of work in the area of culture transformation within an organization, because it makes a big difference. And the word we hear a lot of in the workplace these days is authenticity.
Yeah.
People, especially young people, are seeking authenticity from the companies they work for and from those around them. Is that something you're seeing on the increase too?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there are there are some organizations I've recently spoken to when I go to a lot of networking events locally and in London as well. Some of them do say that the recruitment, they are struggling with recruitment, trying to find the right person. But I think, again, it's because they don't always make clear what they want. So the candidate might be presenting their authentic self, but maybe the company themselves are not being honest about who they actually want. So I'm hearing things like, oh, they don't want to do hard work, or they do, there's a lot of young people who not very good, and they're taking the mickey in working. And I always think, I always say to them as well, it's like, well, did you present the work in the role as accurately as possible? There is a lot of things to consider. Have you tried speaking with them? Maybe they're not aware. With all that stuff, with all the kind of what's required of them. I just think that the thinking is almost, again, very old-fashioned, and I say old-fashioned in the nicest possible way, but it's more like it's very traditional. So they're not embracing, I feel, the authenticity that younger generations are bringing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that, because one of the things I found in my research is that relationship between the management team and the newer members of the teams coming in as graduates or whatever level is that relationship is really, really important today. And you can't take anything for granted. You've got to keep working together, and I genuinely believe management has probably never been harder than it is today, to be able to show that true authenticity. You can't just be there in your boardroom and not expect to be seen, on the floor of the company. I want to come to the whole thing of the engagement, if you like, within the workplace, because we're seeing levels of quiet quitting rising. We hear all the time from Gallup, their annual survey each year on engagement, showing that it's an all-time low. And there's a lot not happening clearly within organizations to get that engagement. So what do you feel is the issue there in terms of engagement? Because we also hear about quiet quitting, where people are leaving but will actually just not performing until they can get their next job. And let's be honest, at the moment, with a tightening labour market where there's more people looking for less jobs available, that could become an even bigger issue. So where do you see the challenge in your role as in HR with engagement?
So I feel any engagement surveys or anything that companies do, first things first, they need to consider whether it's just performative, i.e., are they only doing it once a year? It's also important to have regular touch points. I feel like there's a lot of newer organizations who are joining the kind of like working world, where they genuinely believe in the engagement of their company, of their employees, and they want to understand exactly what's making them tick, what's supporting them. So they therefore make sure the training for the managers is quite robust. I think it all goes hand in hand. Where when you want, when you kind of like put out an engagement survey, what you're asking is how you feel working for the company. But a lot of the time, what employees end up doing, especially when they're unhappy with their manager, is just turn it into a whinge fest and just complain about the managers instead, rather than actually. So for me, that it's really important that the messaging is correct. That you explain to employees that we want you to tell us how it feels to work for the company as a whole, but where they identify that it is turning into a bit of wage, they need to ensure that the managers are properly trained. So it could be that the manager, they are particularly struggling with this employee, hence the reason why sometimes the engagement is not great. But I feel that it's very important that if organizations have regular touch points with their employees, so perhaps rather than doing the survey once a year, do it every 3 months, every quarter, because then it means that at any given time, how your employees are feeling. And again, how engaged they are, again, with addressing the quiet quitting element as well. That seems to be a very big thing at the moment. But you're right, the labour market is very tight at the moment. So there are a lot more, even though they are roles, there are a lot more people applying to them. So it's a really difficult situation. But it's again, generally, there's a famous saying, and you may or may not have heard of it, is that people don't leave organizations, they leave bad managers. So that is something that's, so essentially that is where the engagement piece is very important, because you need to make sure your managers are effectively trained and supported themselves in order for them to deliver the same to their direct reports. Cascades.
One of the trends Yeah, no, one of the trends I hear is, exactly what you're talking about there. But I'm hearing a lot at the moment about people want their communication to be more personal within an organization. What are you seeing when it comes to communication between generations within an organization in terms of trends? And let's hear best practice. What are some of the really positive things some organizations who seem to have it right, seem to engage? What are they doing when it comes to their communication to make that work so well?
It is effectively the communication they have with their employees. So essentially making sure there is a good staff notice board, company updates, regular, town halls, or, whatever organizations tend to call it, spotlight events, essentially, regular engagement pieces, staff events. That generally tends to kind of really help bring everyone together. Even the remote companies do it really well. They have like an in-person event once a year, but even then they have engagement, or they have like a very fun, a lot of events throughout the year that to support employees who are working remotely. But for me, I think that in organizations that are doing it well is because they're keeping communication front and center with everyone, so everyone knows exactly what's going on in the company.
It's somewhat ironic, isn't it? It's never been easier to communicate, but at the same time, we've probably never had less actual communication that's cutting through all the noise. And one of the things I talk a lot
Absolutely.
about is what I call omnichannel, where you're communicating across many different channels to make sure that you capture everybody according to their preferred style of communication.
Yeah.
So I want to finish off. Believe it or not, the time is running away with it as
Oh wow,
always. I
gosh.
want to finish off with some top tips that you have from an HR perspective. First of all, or in a moment, I'm going to come to those who are applying for jobs. What can they be doing? What are the things that you're seeing through the application process and then starting work? But first, I wanted you to talk about some of the best practices. What are the things that organizations can do that is going to make their HR function even more effective than it is? What are the best practices?
So, in terms of communicating across generations, I would say listen first. Don't assume you know what someone wants based on their age. It's very easy to have that bias. Flex your style. What motivates a 25-year-old may not motivate a 55-year-old, and that's okay. Um, be clear on the why. So all generations respond better when they understand the reasoning behind decisions. So be very, very explicit. Don't confuse different with wrong. So a preference for WhatsApp over email isn't laziness, it's just communication style, essentially. And another example of that is voice notes. Some people love leaving voice notes on WhatsApp, some people hate it. So it's again flexing that ability. And then also create space for reverse mentoring. Younger and older employees have a lot to learn from each other, and I think that's key. There's a lot of things that I feel like there can be some harmonization between them. They can learn from each other.
I love that reverse mentoring, or what some people call as mutual mentoring. I think that's a great concept. And I really love your concept there about don't judge someone by their communication style or their preferred communication style. I think there's a huge amount of wisdom in that. What about the young? What should people coming into the workplace, especially thinking of Gen Z, but anybody coming into the workplace for the first time, maybe going through the recruitment process right now, what are some strong tips for them? First of all, in the application process, we haven't even talked about AI yet.
Oh gosh, yes.
But then also when you get into an organization, the sort of things that you can do that's going to accelerate your potential progress.
So I would say that the tips I'm giving are not fundamentally different to anyone who is looking for a role, but I appreciate that younger generations may not be as aware of them. Is essentially research the organization, always tailor your CV, your covering letter. Your CV stays pretty much static because obviously it demonstrates your work experience, but covering letters is your chance to shine. Don't rely heavily on AI to do it. Your true voice should come through. You should ensure that it really speaks to the recruiter, because on the flip side, some companies are using AI recruiting ATS systems where they use AI to filter through applications. So I'm sure that there is a setting where if you spot any AI, please reject the CV immediately. So having that personal tone and personal touch to your covering letter really makes a difference, I feel. And also, again, as I said, research the company, research the organization, and really find a way that you can really incorporate what they do. So, for example, if they've got like a charity, they've got a strong CSR element of the company, then it might be worth kind of talking about that and say, oh, I notice you do X for this charity. I thought that was very interesting. And relate it to maybe perhaps a personal story that you supported in the past with charity. So again, the advice is not very different to what's generally out there, but it's very easy to kind of rely on AI and avoid doing these personalization elements to applications.
And that's what makes it different, isn't it? If you're able to personalize it and genuinely personalize it, whether you are on the receiving end or whether you're applying, that's going to make a massive difference, because it's the one thing that separates us from AI is that personal touch. And I heard recently, I was at an event with Deloitte where someone said, just personalize communication, make it personal, because at the end of the day, that's what we all appreciate. And finally, for you in the world of HR, what would you say to other HR professionals that actually your world is changing, your world is evolving? What should they be doing as HR professionals to be successful in their role today?
Yeah, sure. So I feel that HR has shifted from being purely administrative to a genuine strategic business partner. So and that's evidenced by the roles that I see. There's a lot of HR business partner roles out there, I feel. Employment law has become more complex. Businesses can't afford to wing it anymore. So it's important that HR are, again, front and center in supporting them. The rise of hybrid and flexible working has changed how employers manage, motivate, and retain people. So that's always going to be on the table. Some companies have embraced it wholly. Some companies are like, well, slowly transitioning back to 3 days and 4 days and 5 days in the office. But I don't think it'll ever completely go away. Mental health and well-being are now front and center in HR conversations. It's completely reshaped the landscape, and it's not as taboo to speak about as well. So I think that's a really good important kind of topic to be aware of. And finally, I mean, you mentioned it earlier as well, Alistair, AI and technology are reshaping how HR teams operate, but the human element remains irreplaceable always.
Great advice. I think you've managed to capture that for not only if you're someone applying, if you're somebody who's looking for new staff or looking at retaining your staff, and then finally, of course, people who are in the HR world themselves. Farzana, it's been great chatting to you. I think we could have gone on for another 2 hours. So many things when it comes to HR that's so critically important for organisations and for people within those organisations. Yes. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing some really valuable advice.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure, as I said, and look forward to hopefully talking again in the future.
Absolutely. I think we've definitely got some more topics of conversation there. And I wish you all the best with your company, Face-to-Face HR. I hope you continue to thrive. I think the fact that you're looking for trends and changing all the time, you will do. But for the moment, Farzana Parkar, thank you very much indeed for being a guest. And thank you for joining us as well. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another guest showing us how we can bridge the generation gap. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.